The lecture hall at Meridian Prime Academy buzzed with quiet conversation as students from dozens of species took their seats. And the massive space station that housed the Galactic Academy of Historical Studies rotated slowly against the backdrop of distant stars, creating an ever-changing view through the transparent dome overhead. Kevin Martinez adjusted his datapad and glanced around the room at his classmates, wondering not for the first time if he belonged here among so many brilliant minds from across known space. But he pushed the thought aside as Professor Velthus entered the hall, carrying a large container. The Caraxan professor stood nearly 3 meters tall, his 6 arms moving with practiced grace as he set the container on the demonstration table at the front of the room. And his chitinous faceplates shifted into what Kevin had learned to recognize as a smile. "Good morning, students," Professor Velthus began, his voice modulated by a translator that gave him a slight musical quality. And the class settled into attentive silence. Today we examine the pre-space flight weapons of various civilizations, focusing particularly on the primitive armaments of Earth, the professor continued while opening the container to reveal an assortment of bladed weapons and polearms. Kevin felt a flutter of interest mixed with apprehension as he recognized medieval European designs among the collection, and beside him, Lisa Chun leaned forward with curiosity evident in her expression's writh. The Vulcaran student who sat in the front row clicked his mandibles in what Kevin knew was his species' equivalent of eager anticipation. And the insectoid alien had made no secret of his belief that humans were newcomers who had little to contribute to galactic academia. Professor Velthus lifted a long sword from the collection with 2 of his 6 hands, holding it horizontally for the class to observe. And the blade caught the light from overhead fixtures. Note the symmetry of design. The professor lectured while rotating the weapon, and several students activated recording devices to capture the demonstration. The metallurgy is crude by our standards, but shows remarkable craftsmanship for a pre-industrial species, Velthus continued, and he gripped the handle with one hand while gesturing with another set of arms. The balance point here, he indicated a spot near the guard, shows where the weapon's weight concentrates. And this tells us about the intended use in ceremonial combat. Kevin's jaw tightened slightly as he watched the professor demonstrate what he claimed was the proper grip. And the human student could see immediately that everything about the handling was wrong. The professor held the sword like a club, with his grip too far back on the handle and the blade angled incorrectly. And when Velthus made a slow sweeping motion to show how humans supposedly fought with such weapons, Kevin had to suppress a wince. These primitive weapons required brute strength rather than technique, the professor explained to the attentive class. And Zrith nodded in agreement while taking notes. Lisa glanced sideways at Kevin and raised an eyebrow questioningly, having known him long enough to recognize when something bothered him. But Kevin just shook his head slightly and continued watching. Professor Velthus proceeded through several other weapons, including a Viking axe that he claimed was designed for throwing, a Japanese katana that he held backwards, and a medieval warhammer that he described as a mining tool adapted for combat. Each explanation made Kevin increasingly uncomfortable, and he found himself gripping his datapad more tightly with each inaccurate assessment. The curious aspect of Earth weapons, Velthus continued while setting down the katana, is that they show little evolution in design over thousands of years, which suggests limited innovation in military thinking. That statement finally pushed Kevin past his hesitation, and he raised his hand slowly but firmly. Professor Velthus paused mid-sentence and turned his multiple eyes toward the human student, and the room fell silent as other students shifted to see who had interrupted the lecture. "Yes, Kevin Martinez," the professor said with what might have been curiosity or irritation, and his translator made it difficult to tell which professor with respect. "The sword is being held incorrectly. Kevin said as calmly as he could manage. And he heard a few surprised clicks and chirps from alien students. Around him, Zrith's mandibles spread wide in what was definitely amusement. And the Valkyron turned in his seat to look back at Kevin with obvious skepticism. "Please explain," Professor Velthus said after a moment, and two of his hands placed the longsword back on the table, while his other arms crossed in a gesture Kevin had. Learned meant he was listening, but unconvinced, Kevin stood up and made his way down the tiered seating to the demonstration area, very aware that every eye in the room was now focused on him. "May I?" he asked while gesturing toward the sword. And Professor Velthus inclined his head in permission. Kevin picked up the longsword and immediately felt the wrongness of it. And his suspicions were confirmed as he tested the balance and weight distribution. "This is a replica," Kevin began carefully. "But it's a poorly made one that doesn't understand how these weapons actually functioned." He held the sword properly with both hands on the grip, showing the correct spacing and angle. And then he pointed to a spot about 10 centimeters from where the professor had indicated. "The balance point should be here," Kevin explained while letting the sword rest naturally in his grip. "But this replica has it too far forward, which makes the blade feel heavy and sluggish." Zrith made a dismissive gesture with one clawed limb and spoke up, his translator rendering his clicks as words with a condescending tone. "Surely the exact handling of primitive weapons hardly matters for historical study," the Valkyron said. And several other students murmured in agreement. Kevin took a slow breath and looked at Professor Velthus rather than responding to Zrith directly. And the professor's expression was unreadable behind his chitinous features. "With permission, I can demonstrate why it matters," Kevin offered. And he kept his voice respectful but confident. Professor Velthus was quiet for a long moment. And the silence in the lecture hall stretched uncomfortably as the professor seemed to weigh the request against academic protocol. "Very well," Velthus finally said. And he gestured with two hands for Kevin to continue while the other four folded in a posture of attentive observation. Kevin lifted the sword and moved through a basic guard position. And even with the poor balance, muscle memory from years of historical fencing practice made the movements look natural. "Watch how the blade moves," Kevin said while transitioning to another position. And the sword wobbled slightly in ways that a proper weapon never would. He set down the poorly balanced replica and picked up another sword from the collection, this one a shorter gladius-style blade. And the difference was immediately apparent in how it settled into his hands. "This one is better balanced," Kevin explained while demonstrating the same movements. "And you can see how much more controlled the motion becomes when the weight is properly distributed." Lisa had moved down from her seat to watch more closely, and her engineering background made her nod in understanding as Kevin showed the mechanical differences. The original weapons were tools designed through centuries of trial and error in actual combat. Kevin continued while carefully setting down the gladius. And he turned to address the whole class now. "When you make a replica without understanding the functional requirements, you end up with something that looks right but performs completely wrong," he explained. And he could see some students beginning to lean forward with genuine interest. "The pommel on the longsword is too light," Kevin said while picking up the first weapon again. "And the grip angle is off by at least 15 degrees from what the historical examples show." He demonstrated by holding the sword at what felt natural for the design versus what the replica's construction forced. And the difference was visible even to alien students unfamiliar with human biomechanics. Professor Velthus reached out with one hand to take back the longsword, and he held it the way Kevin had demonstrated rather than his previous grip. The Virgin then held it the way Kevin had demonstrated rather than his previous grip. Professor's eyes widened slightly as he processed the difference, and his other hands made small adjusting movements as if testing the new information. "How do you know this?" Velthus asked. And his tone had shifted from skeptical to genuinely curious. "I studied historical European martial arts back on Earth," Kevin explained. "And we worked with properly balanced reproduction, weapons based on surviving examples and historical texts describing their use." Zrith's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Kevin was learning to recognize as cognitive dissonance. And the Velcaron student stared at the weapons on the table with new uncertainty. The lecture hall had grown completely silent except for the ambient of the station's life support systems. And Kevin could feel the weight of dozens of gazes from species he still couldn't always read. Professor Velthus set down the sword with careful deliberation, using all 6 hands. And then he looked at Kevin with an expression that might have been respect or might have been something else entirely. "It seems," the professor said slowly, "that we may need to reconsider our entire approach to studying pre-spaceflight weapons." Word spread through Meridian Prime Academy faster than Kevin had expected, and within an hour of the lecture ending, 3 more professors had arrived at the historical studies lab requesting demonstrations. Professor Velthus had extended the class session by 2 hours, much to the surprise of students who had other lectures scheduled. But the Caraxians seemed genuinely fascinated by what Kevin's observations revealed about their collection. The lab now held nearly 40 weapons laid out on examination tables. And Kevin moved from piece to piece while explaining the problems he identified. "This Viking axe has the wrong head to haft ratio," Kevin said while lifting the weapon with both hands. And he could feel the unnatural front heaviness immediately. A real warrior would be exhausted after a dozen swings, he continued while demonstrating the awkward motion required to control the poorly balanced tool. And in actual combat, that means death. Lisa had brought her portable computer and was recording measurements as Kevin assessed each weapon. And her engineering mind translated his practical observations into quantifiable data. "The center of mass is 43 millimeters too far forward," Lisa announced while her scanner analyzed the axe's weight distribution. And she added the data to her growing spreadsheet. Professor Harnick, a Thringian military historian who specialized in extinct civilizations, watched with 4 of his eye stalks while taking notes with his manipulator tentacles. "If Earth weapons in our collection are this inaccurate," Harnick said in his bubbling voice that the translator rendered as concerned, "then what about weapons from species we can no longer ask?" The implication hung in the air like a physical weight. And Kevin saw Professor Velthus's posture shift into what he now recognized as troubled contemplation. Zrith had remained in the lab despite his earlier skepticism. And the Velcaron student approached the examination table with visible hesitation in his movements. "How can you be certain these assessments are correct?" Zrith asked. And his mandibles clicked in a pattern Kevin couldn't quite interpret. "When you are working from memory and training rather than archaeological evidence," Kevin set down the axe carefully before responding. And he appreciated that Zrith was at least asking genuine questions now instead of dismissing him outright, because the principles of leverage and balance are universal. Kevin explained while gesturing to the weapons laid out before them. And because humans documented our martial knowledge extensively, he activated his datapad and pulled up images of medieval fighting manuscripts, showing detailed illustrations of proper weapon grips and stances from texts that were centuries old. These are from German and Italian fencing masters who wrote training manuals in the 14 and 1500s. Kevin continued while scrolling through the images. And they described not just techniques, but the reasons behind weapon design. Lisa enlarged one image on the lab's main display screen, showing a detailed diagram of a longsword with annotations in medieval German about balance points and striking methods. Earth's history was unfortunately filled with constant warfare, Kevin said quietly. And he felt the familiar mix of shame and pragmatism that came with discussing humanity's violent past. But that meant weapons development was taken very seriously. He continued, and knowledge was preserved because lives depended on it being accurate. Professor Harnick moved closer to examine the medieval manuscripts, and several of his eye stalks focused on different parts of the diagrams. Simultaneously, the Threnian Empire kept similar records, Harnick said thoughtfully. But they were considered too crude for academic study and were archived rather than analyzed. Kevin nodded in understanding and pulled up another set of images. These showing Japanese sword-making techniques and martial arts training methods that had been preserved for generations. Different cultures. Same principle, he explained while the class and visiting professors studied the evidence. And practical knowledge passed down through direct teaching, because reading about balance isn't the same as feeling it. Zrith's entire posture changed as he processed this information, and the Vulcaran's mandibles moved in rapid patterns that Kevin's translator identified as intense cognitive activity. "I need to contact my homeworld," Zrith said suddenly, and his voice carried an urgency that made everyone turn to look at him. The Vulcaran historical archives contain military texts from our ancient warrior periods, Zrith explained while activating his own communication device. But they were deemed too violent and barbaric for modern scholarly review. Professor Velthus straightened to his full height, and all 6 of his arms moved in gestures that Kevin had learned meant he was experiencing a significant realization. "We have been studying warfare from a sanitized academic perspective," Velthus said slowly, and his translator captured what sounded like dismay in his voice. "We removed the violence from our understanding," the professor continued, "and in doing so, we removed the very context that made these objects what they were." Lisa finished her scan of another weapon and looked up from her computer with an expression of growing concern on her face. "Professor Velthus, if I may," she said while pulling up her compiled data on the main screen. "I've been running simulations based on Kevin's assessments." The screen filled with animated models showing properly balanced weapons versus the Academy's replicas in combat scenarios. And the differences were stark and undeniable. A warrior using these poorly balanced replicas would expend 37% more energy per engagement. Lisa explained while the simulations ran through various fighting sequences. Reaction times would be slower. She continued as the data updated. Recovery between strikes would take longer, and defensive positions would be weaker. Professor Harnick's tentacles trembled slightly as he watched the simulations, and his voice bubbled with what the translator rendered as distress. "My entire published work on the fall of the Kranthi Empire assumed their weapons performed as our replicas suggest," Harnick said, and Kevin could hear genuine anguish beneath the translated words. "But if the replicas are wrong," the Threnian professor continued, "then my conclusions about their military capabilities are wrong, and the historical narrative of their extinction may be completely inaccurate." The weight of that statement settled over everyone in the lab, like a heavy blanket, and Kevin suddenly understood why Professor Velthus had looked so troubled. This wasn't just about correcting a few museum pieces, he realized, but this was about potentially rewriting significant portions of recorded galactic history. "We need to present this to the Galactic Historical Society," Professor Velthus announced, and his 6 arms moved in decisive gestures that brooked no argument. "Kevin Martinez, you will prepare a formal presentation of your findings," Velthus continued, and he fixed the human student with an intense gaze from his multiple eyes. "Lisa Chun, your simulation data will provide the quantitative support," the professor added while turning to acknowledge her contribution, "and I will contact colleagues across the academic community." Velthus finished, because this affects every institution that studies pre-spaceflight military history. Zrith approached Kevin directly for the first time since the initial confrontation. And the Velkaren's body language showed none of his earlier hostility. "I owe you an apology," Zrith said. And his mandibles moved in patterns that Kevin's translator identified as formal contrition. "And I request permission to contribute Velkaran historical sources to your presentation." Kevin extended his hand in the human gesture of reconciliation. And after a moment's hesitation, Zrith gripped it with his primary manipulator claw. "I'd appreciate that," Kevin said honestly, "because this is bigger than any one species or perspective, and we need all the evidence we can gather." The lab continued buzzing with activity as more professors arrived and students spread word through the academic networks. But Kevin felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had simply pointed out that some weapons were poorly balanced, thinking it was a minor correction to academic understanding. But now he was apparently going to present findings that could overturn established historical narratives to the most prestigious scholarly body in known space. Lisa noticed his expression and moved closer while pretending to adjust her equipment. And her voice was quiet enough that only Kevin could hear. "You okay?" she asked with genuine concern in her tone. "I just corrected a professor about sword balance," Kevin said softly. And somehow that turned into questioning centuries of galactic historical scholarship. Lisa smiled slightly and bumped his shoulder with hers in a gesture of support and solidarity. "That's what happens when you're right about something important," she said. "And now you get to see it through." Kevin took a deep breath and looked at the weapons spread across the examination tables, at the professors debating implications in multiple languages that his translators struggled to keep up with, and at Zrith, who's already pulling up ancient Velkaran texts on his display. "I guess I do," Kevin agreed. And he picked up another weapon to continue his assessment, knowing that sleep would be a distant luxury for the foreseeable future. The Galactic Historical Society Council Chamber was far more intimidating than Kevin had imagined. And the circular room stretched up through 3 levels with viewing galleries where academics from across known space gathered to witness the proceedings. Kevin stood at the presentation podium in the center of the chamber floor, very aware that his plain academy uniform looked shabby compared to the elaborate formal robes worn by the council members seated in a ring around him. Administrator Quillen presided from the highest seat, and the elderly Xylophon's crystalline body refracted the chamber lights into subtle rainbow patterns as he called the session to order. "This emergency session has been convened to address claims that our historical weapons collections may contain significant inaccuracies," Quillen announced, and his voice carried naturally through the chamber's acoustic design. "Kevin Martinez of Earth will present his findings," the administrator continued, along with supporting evidence from colleagues representing multiple academic disciplines and species. Kevin activated the presentation system and took a steadying breath, reminding himself that he wasn't just some student making wild claims, but that he had solid evidence and expert support. "Thank you, Administrator," Kevin began, and his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "And thank you to the Council for hearing this presentation." The main display screen came to life with images of various weapons from the Academy's collection, and Kevin launched into his carefully prepared explanation. "The fundamental principle of weapon balance is universal," he started, "because physics and leverage work the same way regardless of which species designed the tool." He showed diagrams illustrating center of mass, point of percussion, and how these factors affected weapon handling, keeping his language as clear and accessible as possible for the multi-species audience. Professor Drexith, a distinguished Caraxian scholar whose 6 arms were draped in academic honors, interrupted before Kevin could continue to his second slide. "With respect," Drexith said in a tone that suggested little actual respect, "this council has heard similar claims before from practical combatants who failed to understand the deeper cultural and historical significance of ceremonial weapons." Kevin had expected this objection and nodded to Lisa, who brought up her simulation data on an auxiliary screen. "These are not ceremonial pieces," Lisa interjected calmly. "And the weapons in question were documented as battlefield implements in their original historical contexts." She ran through several simulations showing the energy expenditure differences, and the mathematical data appeared alongside visual representations that even non-technical council members could understand. A warrior using an improperly balanced weapon faces measurable disadvantages, Lisa explained while the numbers updated in real time. And these disadvantages would have been fatal in actual combat situations. Zrith stepped forward from where he had been standing beside Kevin, and the Velkarin's presence at the presentation had already caused murmurs in the viewing galleries. "I have obtained copies of ancient Velkarin military training manuals," Zrith announced while transmitting files to the Council's shared database. "And these texts were archived 3,000 years ago as too crude for scholarly preservation." The chamber's display screens filled with images of ancient manuscripts showing detailed weapon diagrams and training instructions. And Zrith's mandibles moved in patterns of barely contained excitement. The manuals describe in explicit detail how weapons should be balanced and handled, Zrith continued. And every specification contradicts the replicas currently held in our museums and academic collections. Kevin watched as several council members leaned forward to examine the ancient texts more closely, and he could see the shift in body language that suggested genuine interest rather than dismissal. Professor Harnick rose from his seat in the observation gallery and requested permission to speak, which Administrator Quillen granted with a gesture of his crystalline appendage. "I have contacted retired military officers from 17 different species," Harnick announced, and his eye stalk swept the chamber to ensure everyone was listening. Every single officer confirmed that the weapons representing their species in our collections are inaccurate, the Threan professor continued, and several expressed shock that academics have been studying such poor replicas for centuries. Professor Drexith's arms crossed in a defensive posture, and his voice took on an edge that the translator rendered as barely controlled anger. "This council is being asked to overturn established scholarship based on the opinions of military personnel," Drexith argued, "and we risk reducing complex historical artifacts to mere tools, while ignoring their cultural meanings." Kevin had anticipated this line of reasoning as well, and he stepped forward with confidence he hadn't known he possessed a week ago. "Understanding function doesn't diminish cultural significance," Kevin responded firmly, "but rather it enhances our comprehension of what these objects meant to the people who created and used them." He pulled up examples of Earth weapons and their associated cultural practices, showing how the physical requirements of combat shaped everything from social structures to artistic traditions. "A weapon's design tells us about the society that made it," Kevin explained while images cycled through the display, including the threats they faced, the resources they controlled, and the values they held important enough to fight for. He gestured to a poorly balanced replica on one screen and a properly constructed weapon on another, and the visual comparison made his point clear. A replica that doesn't function correctly tells us nothing true about any of those factors," Kevin continued. "And worse, it actively misleads us into false conclusions about historical capabilities and motivations." Administrator Quillen raised one crystalline hand to request silence as murmuring broke out among the council members, and the chamber quickly quieted. "The question before this council," Quillen said thoughtfully, "is whether we are willing to challenge our established methodologies based on evidence that contradicts comfortable assumptions." Professor Velthus stood from his seat and addressed the chamber with all 6 arms spread in a gesture of formal testimony. "I have spent 40 years studying pre-space flight weapons," Velthus announced, "and I believed I understood them thoroughly through academic analysis and cultural context. The Caraxian professor paused and looked directly at Kevin before continuing, and his expression was difficult for the human to read, but seemed genuine. Kevin Martinez taught me in one afternoon that I had been studying decorative objects rather than functional tools, Velthus said, and that my understanding was incomplete because I never questioned whether our replicas accurately represented the originals. Velthus turned to address the full council now, and his voice carried the weight of professional authority built over decades. We have been studying warfare from an ivory tower, he continued, and we removed ourselves so far from the practical realities that we stopped seeing the truth right in front of us. Several council members shifted uncomfortably at this assessment, and Kevin could see the political calculations happening behind alien features as they weighed tradition against accuracy. Professor Drexith stood again, and his posture radiated barely suppressed frustration as he prepared to counter Velthus's testimony. If we accept this reasoning, Drexith argued, then we must acknowledge that every major work on extinct species military capabilities may be fundamentally flawed. The implications sent a wave of alarm chattering through the viewing galleries, and Kevin realized that Drexith wasn't opposing the findings because they were wrong, but because they were right and the consequences were staggering. That is precisely what we must acknowledge. Professor Harnack interjected before anyone else could speak, and his tentacles moved in emphatic gestures. The Krenethi Empire, the Solvan Collective, the Threnian warrior states, Harnack listed, and dozens of other extinct civilizations whose military defeats we have studied for centuries. The Threnian professor's voice grew more urgent as he continued, and his eye stalks focused on different council members in turn. What if they weren't actually outmatched? Harnack asked. But what if we simply misunderstood their capabilities because we were working from inaccurate replicas and incomplete analysis? Administrator Quillen raised both crystalline hands to quiet the chamber as the noise level rose dramatically, and it took several moments before order was restored. This council will vote on whether to implement new standards for historical weapons research across all member institutions, Quillen announced, and the vote will be recorded and transmitted to all academic bodies in known space. Kevin felt his heart racing as he watched council members consult with advisors and access data files, and Lisa moved closer to stand beside him in a gesture of moral support. Srith remained at the podium as well, and the Velkaren's presence sent a clear message that this wasn't just human opinion but a multi-species recognition of scholarly failure. The voting process took nearly an hour as each of the 63 council members formally registered their position, and the tally displayed on screens showed the count climbing toward the required two-thirds majority when the final vote was cast. Administrator Quillen's crystalline body flashed with refracted light as he stood to announce the results. The motion passes, Quillen declared. Kevin sat in Professor Drexith's private research office 3 days after the council vote, surrounded by holographic displays showing star maps and historical battle records from civilizations that no longer existed. The Krenethi Empire controlled 47 star systems at its peak, Drexith explained while manipulating the display to show territorial boundaries, and collapsed within a single generation to the Vorten hegemony. Lisa occupied another chair with her portable computer open, already analyzing the data that Drexith's team had compiled over 15 years of research. Rith stood near a display showing Krenethi weapon designs, and his mandibles moved in thoughtful patterns as he compared them to the ancient Velkaran military texts he had brought. The accepted historical narrative claims the Krenethi were hopelessly outmatched, Drexith continued, and his 6 arms gestured at various data points on the screens. Their weapons were considered inferior, the Caraxian professor said. Their tactics primitive, and their defeat inevitable once they encountered the technologically superior Vortens. Kevin studied the holographic representation of a Krenathi blade weapon, noting immediately that the proportions seemed wrong for practical use. "May I see the actual replica?" Kevin asked. And Drexith nodded toward a secured storage case in the corner of the office. The weapon felt immediately problematic when Kevin lifted it, and the balance was so far forward that controlling the blade required constant muscular effort. This would be exhausting to use in any extended engagement, Kevin said while testing the weapon's movement patterns. And a warrior armed with this would tire quickly against any opponent. Lisa's scanner hummed as she recorded measurements, and her expression grew increasingly concerned as the data populated her screen. "The center of mass is 68 millimeters too far forward," Lisa announced, "and the grip angle forces the wrist into an unnatural position that would cause strain injuries with repeated use." Drexith's posture shifted into what Kevin now recognized as troubled realization, and the professor's voice carried notes of dismay. "Our entire analysis of the Krenathi military capabilities was based on testing these replicas," Drexith admitted, "and we concluded they were poorly designed weapons from a civilization that had not developed sophisticated metallurgy." Kevin set down the Krenathi blade carefully and picked up a Vorten weapon from the same collection. And this one had different problems, but was equally unusable in its current form. "The Vorten blade has the opposite issue," Kevin observed while demonstrating the rear heavy balance. "And this would make precise strikes nearly impossible." He moved through basic attack and defense patterns with both weapons, and even his trained experience couldn't make the poorly balanced replicas function properly. Both sides in this war were supposedly using weapons that don't actually work, Kevin said slowly as the implications crystallized. "Which means we've been studying a conflict where neither participant could have fought the way we think they did." Zrith activated his own display and brought up tactical analyses from the historical records, and his mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed connections. "The Battle of Krenath Prime is described as a rout," Zrith said while highlighting sections of the ancient text. "And the Krenathi defenders supposedly broke and fled after minimal resistance." The Valkyran student pulled up more data, and his entire posture radiated growing excitement as patterns emerged. "But the casualty ratios don't support that narrative," Zrith continued. "And the Vortens lost nearly 40% of their assault force before the Krenathi retreat." Lisa looked up from her computer with wide eyes, and her voice carried the tone of someone solving a complex equation. "That's not a rout," she said firmly. "And those are the casualty figures of a hard-fought, defensive action that was ultimately abandoned for strategic rather than tactical reasons." Drexith sat heavily in his chair, and all 6 of his arms hung loose in a gesture of profound shock. 15 years, the professor said quietly. "And I never questioned whether the weapons in our collection accurately represented the originals." Kevin felt sympathy for the Coraxian despite their earlier antagonism, and he understood the weight of realizing that years of work might be fundamentally flawed. "We can fix this," Kevin offered, "and we can reevaluate the entire conflict with proper understanding of what both sides' weapons could actually do." Drexith looked up at Kevin with an expression that the human was learning to read as cautious hope, and the professor's voice regained some of its professional strength. "I need you to assess every weapon in our extinct species collection," Drexith said, "and then we rebuild our analysis from accurate foundations over the following weeks." Kevin's temporary office in the research wing became a hub of activity as weapons from long dead civilizations were brought for examination. Lisa's simulations grew more sophisticated as she incorporated data from multiple species, and her engineering expertise translated Kevin's practical observations into quantifiable measurements. Rith divided his time between helping Kevin with assessments and coordinating with scholars on Valkyra, who were excavating archived military texts from other extinct civilizations. Professor Velthus visited regularly to observe the work and assist with coordinating academic resources. And the Caraxians' enthusiasm for the project never seemed to diminish. The Solven Collective's weapon designs show clear evolution over time, Kevin explained during one assessment session. And this suggests they were actively refining their tools based on combat experience. He demonstrated the differences between early and late Solven blades, showing how the balance points had shifted and the grip designs had been modified. This isn't a primitive species making random design choices, Kevin continued. But this is systematic improvement based on practical feedback from warriors in the field. Drexith recorded every observation with meticulous care, and his earlier resistance had transformed into almost obsessive attention to detail. If the Solven were this sophisticated, Drexith mused aloud, then their defeat by the Threnian warrior states needs complete re-examination. Professor Harnick had joined the research team after the council vote, and the Threnians' expertise in extinct species conflicts proved invaluable as they cross-referenced multiple historical sources. The Threnian records described the Solven as brave but poorly equipped, Harnick said while reviewing documents from his species archives. But this may have been propaganda rather than accurate assessment. Lisa pulled up comparative data on her screens and gestured for the others to look at her findings. If we adjust our combat simulations to account for properly balanced weapons on both sides, she explained, then the Solven actually had a significant tactical advantage in close combat scenarios. The simulation played across the display showing hypothetical engagements between Solven and Threnian forces, and the revised outcomes were dramatically different from accepted historical narratives. They didn't lose because they were outmatched, Zrith said slowly as he watched the simulation. And they lost because they were outnumbered and fighting on multiple fronts. Simultaneously, Harnick's tentacles trembled with what his translator identified as profound distress. And the Threnian professor's voice carried notes of shame. My ancestors claimed military superiority, Harnick said quietly. But perhaps we simply had greater numbers and were willing to accept higher casualties. The research team worked in contemplative silence for several moments, and Kevin understood that they were witnessing the painful process of historical revisionism based on uncomfortable truths. This goes beyond academic correction, Drexith finally said. And this affects how modern species understand their own histories and relationships with others. Kevin nodded and set down the Solven weapon he had been examining, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with uncovering uncomfortable historical truths. The Galactic Historical Society needs a full report, Kevin suggested. And we should present our findings before we go any further. Lisa agreed and began organizing their data into presentation format, while Zrith contacted colleagues to gather supporting evidence from newly discovered texts. Professor Velthus entered the office carrying a datapad, and his expression indicated he had news that was either very good or very bad. I have been contacted by the Vorten Historical Institute, Velthus announced, and they want to provide access to their archives regarding the Krenethi conflict. Drexith stood quickly, and his arms moved in agitated patterns that suggested both excitement and apprehension. The Vortens have never allowed external access to those archives, Drexith said, "Adolphi, and scholars have been requesting that material for decades." Velthus nodded and his mandibles moved in what might have been a smile or grimace. They saw our preliminary reports, Velthus explained, and their current government wants historical accuracy, even if it reflects poorly on their ancestors. Claims of military superiority. Kevin felt a mix of emotions at this development, and he realized that their work was resonating far beyond academic circles. When do we leave? Kevin asked. And he was surprised by how natural it felt to assume he would be part of this expanded investigation. Drex looked at Kevin with an expression that conveyed respect and something approaching friendship. And the Caraxian's response held no hesitation. "Tomorrow," Drexa said. "And we all go together as a proper research team." Lisa closed her computer. 6 months after the council vote, Kevin stood in front of a lecture hall at Meridian Prime Academy. And this time he was the one behind the professor's podium rather than sitting in the students' seats. The new Department of Applied Historical Studies occupied an entire wing of the academy now. And the changes that had swept through galactic academic institutions were still reverberating across known space students from 24 different species filled to tiered seating. And Kevin recognized the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism that he had once seen in his own classmates' faces. "Welcome to Applied Weapons History," Kevin began, and his voice carried confidence earned through months of challenging, established narratives and surviving academic scrutiny. "Today we'll examine Viking-era shields," he continued while activating the display screen behind him. "And we'll focus on understanding how construction methods affected tactical deployment." He lifted a properly balanced shield replica from the demonstration table. And this one had been constructed according to archaeological evidence and historical texts, rather than aesthetic assumptions. "Pass this around," Kevin instructed while handing the shield to a student in the front row. "And pay attention to how the weight distributes across your arm. When you hold it correctly." The shield made its way through the class, and Kevin watched as students from species with radically different physiologies each found ways to test the balance and constructions. Rith sat in the front row now as a teaching assistant rather than a skeptical student. And the Velkaron had become Kevin's closest colleague over the months of research and travel. "Note the position of the grip relative to the boss," Zrith added while the shield reached a Karachian student. "And observe how that placement affects leverage during defensive movements." Lisa entered through the back door and took a seat in the observation area. And she had recently been appointed as the head of the Academy's new Historical Engineering Department. The academic restructuring had created opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration that would have been impossible under the old system. And the changes extended far beyond just weapons study. Professor Velthus watched from the doorway with obvious pride in his expression. And the Caraxian had announced his retirement, but remained as an advisor to the new department's Kevin demonstrated proper shield wall formations using volunteer students. And he explained how the individual weapon characteristics scaled up to affect unit tactics and strategic deployment. The engineering requirements of the shield dictated military organization. Kevin lectured while the students maintained their formation. And understanding construction helps us understand why Viking raiders operated in specific unit sizes. A young Threnian student raised a tentacle to ask a question, and Kevin nodded for her to speak. "Professor Martinez," the student began. And Kevin still hadn't gotten used to being called professor. "How do we know when our understanding is complete?" Kevin appreciated the thoughtful nature of the question and took a moment to consider his response carefully. "We never know if our understanding is complete," he answered honestly. "And the best we can do is remain open to new evidence and willing to revise our conclusions when presented with better information." He gestured to the weapons and artifacts around the classroom, and his voice carried the weight of recent experience 6 months ago. "The academic community thought it understood these objects," Kevin continued. "And it took someone questioning basic assumptions to reveal how much we had wrong." Zrith stood and moved to the demonstration area, and his mandibles moved in patterns that Kevin now recognized as his colleague preparing to make an important point. "The Volcaran Historical Society has begun republishing ancient military texts," Zrith announced to the class. "And we are discovering that our ancestors documented detailed, practical knowledge that scholars ignored for 3,000 years." The students leaned forward with interest as Rith displayed images of recently translated manuscripts, and the Valkyran's enthusiasm for the project was evident in his body language. We assumed our warrior past was shameful, Zrith continued, and in hiding from it we lost valuable historical understanding. Kevin nodded in agreement and pulled up his own display showing similar discoveries from other species. Archives, the Threnian warrior states, the Coraxian border conflicts, the Solvan resistance, Kevin listed while images cycled through the screen. And every extinct or surviving civilization kept practical military records that modern academics had dismissed as too crude for study. Professor Harnick entered the classroom pushing a cart loaded with newly acquired weapons replicas, and the Thranians' multiple eye stalks swept the room in greeting, fresh from the forge. Harnick announced cheerfully, "And these are proper reproductions made in consultation with master craftspeople who understand functional requirements." The students gathered around as Harnick began distributing weapons for examination, and Kevin watched with satisfaction as they immediately began testing balance and discussing construction methods. This was what education should look like, Kevin thought. And this was the integration of theory and practice that produced genuine understanding. Lisa approached the demonstration area and gestured for Kevin's attention, and her expression suggested she had news to share. The Vorton Institute just released their full archives, Lisa said quietly, and the data confirms everything we suspected about the Krenethi conflict. Kevin felt a mix of vindication and sadness at this confirmation, and the rewriting of that particular historical narrative had been especially contentious. The Krenethi weren't primitive or poorly equipped, Kevin said, more to himself than to Lisa, and they were fighting a defensive war against an aggressor who later rewrote history to justify conquest. Professor Drexith appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the mention of his life's work, and the Coraxian moved into the classroom with the careful dignity of someone carrying important news. The Galactic Historical Society has officially revised the historical status of 17 extinct civilizations, Drexith announced, and the Krenethi Empire is no longer classified as a failed primitive state, but as a sophisticated civilization that fell to overwhelming numerical superiority. The weight of that statement hung in the classroom air, and Kevin saw several students exchange glances as they processed the implications. This matters beyond academic accuracy, Drexith continued while addressing the full class, and this affects how modern species understand their relationships with each other and their own historical narratives. A Valkyran student raised a claw tentatively, and Drexith gestured for the question. Does this mean some species are descended from aggressors rather than superior civilizations? The student asked, and their voice carried uncertainty. Drexith's 6 arms moved in contemplative patterns before he responded, and his voice held both firmness and compassion. It means we understand history more accurately, Drexith said, and we recognize that military victory doesn't equal moral or cultural superiority. Kevin added his own perspective while moving to stand beside Drexith in a gesture of professional solidarity. Humans have an extremely violent history, Kevin said to the class, and we've been both aggressors and victims across thousands of years of warfare. He pulled up images of Earth's historical conflicts, not shying away from the brutal reality of humanity's past. We're not proud of how much we fought, Kevin continued, but we documented it extensively because we wanted future generations to learn from our mistakes. The classroom had grown very quiet, and Kevin could see students from multiple species processing these ideas with varying degrees of comfort. The practical knowledge we preserved wasn't meant to glorify war, Kevin explained, and it was meant to understand it well enough to hopefully avoid repeating it. Professor Velthus entered fully into the classroom, and his presence immediately commanded respectful attention from everyone present. The Academy has received formal requests from 43 institutions to establish similar applied history programs, Velthus announced. And they want Kevin Martinez to help develop their curricula. Kevin felt simultaneously honored and overwhelmed by this information. And he looked at Zrith and Lisa for support. "We'll need a team," Kevin said after a moment. "And this is too much work for one person or even one species' perspective." Zrith's mandibles moved in patterns of enthusiastic agreement. And Lisa nodded while already pulling out her computer to begin planning. "The team is already forming," Velthus said with what might have been amusement in his translated voice. "And Professor Drexith has agreed to co-direct the expansion program." Drexith's arms spread in a gesture of acceptance. And the formerly antagonistic Caraxian had become one of Kevin's strongest professional allies. "We will ensure that practical knowledge is integrated into historical study across all member institutions," Drexith stated, "and we will train a new generation of scholars who understand that complete historical analysis requires multiple perspectives." The class session continued with students rotating through different weapon examinations, and Kevin moved among them, offering guidance and answering questions. A human student from Earth approached with a medieval mace and asked about proper grip techniques, and Kevin felt a moment of surreal appreciation for how far things had come. 6 months ago, he was just a graduate student correcting a professor about sword balance.